4, 3, and I have to close the blinds. 2, 1. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Burning Subjects. And the burning subject for this episode is Jim, would you like to be the introductor?
Ladies and gentlemen, today's episode of Burning Subjects is all about the Union Pacific STEAM program.
Which, pretty much is the only, the Union Pacific currently is the only major railroad to have a STEAM program still in full motion. And, well, let's start with the history. Let's start with their living legend.
Yes, the 844, a
Yes.
proud northern-type locomotive, the final steam engine built for the Union Pacific. Hang on, I'm just actually going to look up when the steam program actually originally started, because I doubt it was 1960.
Yes. But either way, the 844 is the reason it's called living legend is because it has never been retired from active service. Even to this day, it has never been retired.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
Yeah.
It's the reason it's called living legend. It's never been retired from active service.
Hey, I'm British. I don't know this shit.
Well, but the thing is, since after we talk about 844, we're going to talk about the locomotive that, sacrificed itself for 844 to continue. Which is why that locomotive is the thumbnail for this.
It's the unsung hero of the steam program, if you really think about it.
Yes, the 838. Poor thing.
Salute to the fallen. No.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me just look up the statistics in terms of tractive effort, which is what I kind of like to go for nowadays.
Yes.
Let's see. So who wants to talk first?
Well,
I'm logging now.
I already talked about what I wanted to talk about for a second. So, Jim, you may talk about the statistics for 844.
Okay, so the 844, like I said, is a 484 Northern. I don't know if a lot of people in the Union Pacific really called their 484s Northerns, but technically it's a correct name, so there you go. And there were people out there who thought that it was a one-of-a-kind for some reason, but yeah, I once actually met someone that stupid on Discord, but yeah, the 844 wasn't a one-of-a-kind, because in total there were 45 of these Northerns built, all in various different batches between 1937 and 1944. And each batch was also classified as its own class, rated FEF1 through FEF3. So yes, there was also an FEF2, but anyway. Tractive effort for the 844, let's see. We have 80-inch diameter driving wheels, which gives a good turn of sped. Yes, I intentionally mispronounced that, because it's a meme. Boiler pressure is rated at 300 pounds per square inch. And we have a pair of 25 by 32-inch cylinders. And all of that together gives us 63,750 pounds of tractive effort. Same statistic for the slightly more crude FEF2 Northerns, in case you were interested.
I thought the tractive effort actually would have been a little bit higher, but I guess not. But either way, the 844, it was right from the get-go. After their sort of steam era ended, it was used for their public relations as their new steam program arose. And then you may go.
No, No, that was just somebody just saying. That was just someone just saying that someone's at work right now. So.
Oh,
That was Steven.
yeah. But either way, the 844 was, well, right out of the get-go, it was taken out of its active freight service and passenger service and put into their excursion service, which is their public relations to the railroad, which, of course, is still running today somehow, even though most of the others have sadly corrupted. Press F in the chat. But either way, to say the least, 844 has been operating ever since it was first built.
And since it was first delivered to the Union Pacific in December of 1944, as that year's most awesome Christmas present.
But the 844, well, it wouldn't be steaming today without a brother engine, which sacrificed itself in the name of operation.
Speaking of, just in case anybody was also curious about the original Union Pacific Northerns, those being the FEF ones, they were actually a little bit smaller and noteworthy different and noticeably different in terms of their silhouette. Same boiler pressure, but just slightly smaller cylinder diameter, 24.5 inches, and slightly smaller driving wheels at 77 inch. And that tractive effort is 63,611 pounds. But anyway, in terms of how many Northerns were built, again, 45, and how they were divided, you had the FEF ones, which counted 20, numbered 800 through 819. Then you got the FEF twos in 1939, the FEF ones in 1937, by the way. But the FEF twos were numbered 820 through 834. So again, 15 examples. And then the last 5 are the FEF 3s, built in 1944, numbered 835 through 844. The fellow Northern that has kind of been sacrificed for the 844 had to be an FEF 3, and the engine in question is 838.
Which
after it was retired, it was actually just sitting inside on a storage track in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And then in 1977, I believe, the engine was actually taken to Cheyenne, Wyoming, to be used as a donor locomotive for 844. Because back then, we didn't have any kind of advanced computers to 3D design new components for the engine. So you had to do it the old-fashioned way of finding a locomotive of the exact same class in good condition that could be used to take parts off of it to keep the 844 going.
So to say the least, Dan, you may.
Well, from what I've heard, like 838 is slowly on the journey to being scrapped. But really, I like to consider that like what we said. It's like some kind of a sacrifice. Without 838's parts and shit, then 844 wouldn't be running anymore. I mean, think about it. A locomotive that hasn't been retired from like any form of service yet, and she's still running today, you would think that they would have at least like took some parts off of 838, and that's what they exactly did. Yeah, there's been a lot of, and there's one thing that in particular that a little bit bothers me with 838. There has been some foamers out there that have been nothing more but just fucking angry and shit, and they said they want to restore 838 and run her alongside with 844.
Impossible.
Yeah, I mean she's a donor locomotive. And there's no way that UP would ever consider restoring a locomotive that's specifically now assigned to just being just a parts engine.
I mean,
all right.
Strictly speaking, Dan, it's no longer in donor service, but I think that nowadays the parts are being used to 3D render new parts for the 844. But let me put it this way: I know that that refurbishing the 838 to full operating condition is an idiotic plan. Like, it won't happen. But what I do hope is that if the 838 has completely served its purpose, then maybe a handful of volunteers could get their hands on it, and at the very least,
cosmetically restore it.
Yeah, give it a good cosmetic refurbishment. It doesn't have to run, but the 838 is kind of an unsung hero to the Steam program. So once its purpose has been served, I think it would be nice to see it be put on display at the old passenger station in Cheyenne.
Either that, or she'll be placed on a display at a park.
Yeah,
just somewhere where she's good. Either that, or she'll just continue to stay in the UP Roundhouse in Cheyenne.
All right, Michael, you may speak.
Oh, I was about to say that, of course, if anything, if we're going to talk about 3985 later on, I was going to say that they should have put it on display in the Cheyenne station earlier.
Well, that actually leads us to our next, next moment about their challengers. 3 of them in particular we're going to talk about, actually. 3 of them, yes. 3 of them.
I gotcha.
All right, we're going to talk about the fallen one, the other fallen one, and the one that hasn't fallen but hasn't even risen yet at all. So try guessing what those numbers are. So we're going to talk, either way.
Dibs.
You try it. Yes, Jim, you may talk.
So the extra fallen one, as in a challenger that hasn't been preserved, that will be number 3967. Greetings, Polonius Nuts. You've joined us in Burning Subjects, but I'm in the process of giving a little speech.
Hello there.
Hello there. So the 39...
Kenobi, you are a old one.
Either way.
You've interrupted my speech, Michael.
All right, Jim, you may continue about your speech of the 3 fallen challengers.
Okay, so the 3967, the one challenger that we're talking about here that hasn't been preserved. It was built in 1942 as part of the final new class of steam locomotives designed by Union Pacific personnel, those being the friggin' Jobelmon Challengers, which I like to refer to as the little brother of the big boy, because for one, the Jobelmon Challengers look extremely similar to the big boy. 2, they were indeed slightly smaller, and 3, they're actually slightly younger in terms of, I believe, the blueprints and even the prototype locomotive of both classes. But anyway, 3967 was built in 1942. And in 1953, it would actually get a fairly unique distinction. It was used for the very first steam excursion on the Union Pacific, which happened in May of 1953. I think it was May 17th. But the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club back then sponsored an excursion passenger train, which ran from Denver, Colorado, over Sherman Hill to Laramie, Wyoming. And the locomotive chosen for the job was 3967 because I believe it was one of the favorite locomotives of one of the higher-ranking people in the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club. Now, unfortunately, the locomotive wasn't preserved, but there have been a couple of brief masquerades as the 3967 for the 40th and 50th anniversaries of that first excursion run, respectively.
And next, we're going to talk about the one challenger that still...
Michael wants to talk right now.
Oh, yes, Michael.
Oh, and of course, the date of both excursions were May 17th, which was exactly the same date as my birthday. But Polonius, what do you have to say?
What do you want to say, Peanut?
Yeah, you typed the number 1 in the chat if you want to say something.
Oh, I wanted to ask what the overall topic of the discussion is.
Union Pacific Steam Program.
Talking about the Union Pacific Steam Program.
And the locomotives that operated for it, or kind of inspired it.
Well,
All right. Anyways, continue.
Okay, let's see. Who dropped out here?
Well, the next engine, Jim, you may talk about is the one Challenger that, to be honest, is
Yes. My personal favorite of the UP Steam program, and the currently neglected middle child. But it's still an absolute fucking Chad, and don't you dare say otherwise. That, of course, is my boy, 3985. And yes, I say my boy, not my girl, because it's one of those locomotives that I refuse to identify as a her, because again, Doublemont Challenger, big boy's little brother. If you watch the Extreme Machines episode, Wheels of Steel, you'll get that reference. By the way, would anyone be curious about the tractive effort of the Doublemont Challengers?
yes, actually.
Yes.
Okay. For starters, sexy driving wheels with a diameter of 69 inches.
Nice.
69, dude.
69, dude.
69 dudes! Boiler pressure is rated at 280 pounds per square inch.
Why 200?
By the way, this is for all the Doublemont Challengers, by the way. Even though they got minor improvements, tractive effort and geometry related to that remains the same. And we have a foursome of 21 by 32 inch cylinders because, they were simple articulated.
Foursome.
So when the throttle or regulator valve is open in the steam dome, the steam is supplied from the boiler to 4 equal-sized high-pressure cylinders. Total tractive effort, 97,352 pounds.
And now we get on to the
3985.
The
Built in
story.
1943. And throughout its working life, it really didn't do anything special. It was just used as another freight locomotive on the Wyoming division, if I have to make my guess. Last operated in 1957 in regular service, that is. And then it was retired in 1962. And it remained there with the sole surviving 1944 big boy, number 4023. Like, as in it remained in storage in the Cheyenne Roundhouse. Now, you could say that there's a little bit of speculation here. Like, there's room to speculate as to why they were actually stored. Apologies if I'm also going to take off my earplugs. There we go. Now I can actually hear myself a little bit better. But yeah, some people said that Union Pacific was probably keeping the 3985 and 4023 in a little bit of a reserve for, excursion passenger trains, just in case they got really, really big, like too big for the 844 to handle. But others had a far more serious idea because, back then it was the early 1960s. I mean, the war in Vietnam was still escalating, which was the particular big hot spot in the Cold War, the capitalist West versus the communist East, and in particular America versus the Soviet Union.
Soyuz, Narushimi.
Then, I know you're kidding, but do not betray the North American continent. So yeah, basically, there were some people who were afraid that the Cold War may eventually reach such a big high point that the United States actually had to go to war against the Soviet Union. I mean, they got fairly close to, they got a pretty good taste of what it's like to fight against China during the Korean War of the early 1950s.
China.
And basically, if such a big war would happen, the railroads would be swamped with a massive surge of military freight traffic. And the diesel-electric locomotives that handled the freight trains back then, they weren't very powerful on their own. They were pretty powerful in terms of multiple unit service, but on their own, not really. So therefore, you could say it would be a very good idea to have two of the biggest and most powerful steam locomotives on Earth as a strategic reserve. But that didn't happen. So yeah. But yeah, then in the early 1970s, they were kind of expelled from the Cheyenne Roundhouse, even though I think it wasn't until some point in the 1980s that the stalls that were big enough to handle those beasts were torn down, along with most of the buildings related to UP's steam era in Cheyenne. But yeah, then in 1975, the 4023 was moved. It moved house to Omaha, Nebraska, where it moved house several times within the city border over the next several decades. While 3985 remained in Cheyenne. It was still removed from the yards after sitting outside on the storage tracks for a little bit. But then they put it on a bit of straight track on the parking lot next to the old passenger station, which by then was decommissioned because, Amtrak. But then in 1979, things got very interesting. There were a handful of Union Pacific employed volunteers, namely Steve Lee, Bob Krieger, and the late Lynn Nystrom, who all got together and they thought, you know what, this engine needs to run again. And so, even though they were paid staff from the Union Pacific, they set to work as volunteers, refurbishing the 3985 and bringing it back alive. January of 1981, successful boiler test. And in March of that same year, the engine backed out of the Cheyenne Roundhouse for the first time under its own steam. By that point, 3985 was the biggest operational steam locomotive in the world. And it was put to use for a new job, excursion passenger service, which I believe is also why when it was first out shopped, they actually gave it white walls on all the wheels on the locomotive and tender.
Really?
Really. However, there was a minor inconvenience. The engine was still burning coal.
Oh,
and
yeah.
In 1982, in particular, during some trips in Utah, it was unintentionally good at being a pyromaniac because sparks from the twin smokestacks and like cinders and ashes from the ash pan on the firebox, they landed in all that beautiful dry grass in the very dry countryside of the western United States, and well, the engine set off several line-side grass fires.
Hashtag meet the pyro.
So
Probably Steve Lee accidentally hired Pyro from TF2 as the fireman.
But anyway, by that, eventually the 3985 was kind of caged into only running trips over Sherman Hill between Cheyenne and Laramie in Wyoming. And then in 1990, they decided, you know what, we've had enough. And no, they weren't going to retire the locomotive. They were going to convert it to burn oil. If you prefer coal-fired locomotives, go fucking cry in the corner. We don't care about your opinion. If it has to burn oil in order to work, then it has to burn oil in order to work.
If you look at the stream right now, you can see what I'm doing.
Over no steam engine, okay?
Anyway.
And of course, the reason why 3985 was converted to burn oil is because, during some excursions, she caused...
I already said that, Michael.
Oh.
I already said that. And,
Anyway.
but because the oil conversion was a success, and the old boy actually got several massive advantages. It might have been a little bit cleaner for the environment, so less complaints from environmentalists. It was probably a little bit more fuel efficient. And the big plus points, it could now operate on a much larger portion of the Union Pacific system without any major concerns, or having to store coal or whatever. And of course, the engine then became considerably less expensive to operate and maintain, and to run, of course. But yeah. However, in October of 2010, time finally caught up with 3985.
And
after a few final excursions and getting to pull the Ringley Brothers circus train, I believe, the locomotive was put on the back burner. Well, initially it was taken out of service with the intention of giving it a 2-year rebuild, but there was a big problem. The further the locomotive was taken apart, the more problems and issues that were discovered. because, unfortunately, that initial refurbishment between 1979 and 1981, it simply wasn't up to scratch. Sadly, it wasn't really a case of giving the locomotive all the necessary repairs to be basically like brand new from the factory, in exquisite mechanical shape. I really hate to say this, but unfortunately, because it was a volunteer effort, it was sadly a little bit closer to being a botched job with lots and lots of little band-aid repairs. And yeah, that obviously, over time, it really killed the engine, along with the countless excursion runs and even pulling a few seriously heavy freight trains.
And so sadly, nowadays, the 3985 has been retired. Now it sits inside the shop.
Dickens himself said so in January of 2020. And yet there are people who still believe that the engine is getting a makeover. Which it might get in maybe 15 or 20 or maybe 30 years from now, if we're very lucky. But basically, in the short term, don't hold your breath. The locomotive is officially retired. Not permanently, so there might be just a tiny light at the end of the tunnel, because it's still in the rounders in Cheyenne, and Union Pacific still own the engine. But like long term, there's a very slight chance. Short term, nothing. And this is coming from a 3985 fanboy here. So yeah. Besides, all the damage was also largely, in fact, because the engine was run hard. Like there were plenty of occasions where the engine had been running at high speeds of 70 to 75 miles an hour for prolonged portions of time. So naturally, that's going to do some heavy damage to an engine.
And so, let's have a moment of silence for the 3985. Anyway, now for the next challenger, the one that hasn't operated in excursion service, but has been preserved.
Yep, number 3977, also built in 1943. It actually has a fairly unique distinction nowadays among preserved Union Pacific steam locomotives, because it's the only one to currently be preserved in the Greyhound color scheme, which is a two-tone, so basically, two shades of gray with either silver or yellow paint for some pinstriping along the tender, cab, and even the walkways. And of course, that also counts for the lettering and numbering. But yeah, the 3977, it actually had a fairly interesting revenue career compared to 3985. Like between 1946 and 1952. The Union Pacific decided to already convert 18 of their Jobelmont Challengers to burn oil instead of coal. But in order to actually further distinct them, at least for running on the Wyoming division, they decided to completely renumber them. Now, the numbering is all a little bit slapdash, but collectively they were all renumbered into the 3700 series. So they became engines 3700 and 3717. In case you want to know the exact order, Jobelmont Challengers 3930 through 3937, which were the first 10 out of the last batch of 20, became engines 3700 through 3707. And then the first 10 of the 1943 order, so 3975 through 3984, became 3708 through 3717 in those exact numerical orders, meaning that 3977 at one point was briefly numbered to 3710. Not to mention, it was also one of those Challenger locomotives that was fitted with smoke deflectors, which worked pretty good, though from what I've heard, they actually came at a very slight disadvantage because they were actually kind of tilted inwards towards the smoke box door. So you actually had a little bit less visibility out of the windows in the cab, even though visibility would already be restricted as hell because of how friggin' long the boiler is. But yeah, nowadays it's preserved at Cody Park in North Platte, Nebraska. And what's fairly interesting is that it's actually preserved on a curved piece of track. Like if you imagine the locomotive moving forward, it would actually be going through a left-hand curve, so you can literally see the front half of the frame with the first set of steam cylinders and driving wheels literally being offset from the rest of the boiler. So it kind of looks like the engine is stuck in suspended animation, almost like it's more alive than it really is.
And what makes 3977 a bit more unique is really the fact that, for me, honestly, is because she's wearing Greyhound. Like, you don't really see it. I mean, I've seen like a bunch of photos of Union Pacific steam locomotives preserved, and you don't really see any steam locomotives in the Greyhound scheme like nowadays.
Yeah.
All right.
Really, I
Next.
think it looks gorgeous on her.
Yeah, like I said, it's currently the only UP steam locomotive preserved in Greyhound color scheme.
Well, next we're going to talk about 3 Union Pacific big boys.
3.
Yes, 3. Well, I'll get back to you in a little bit, but you guys talk about the challengers for a little bit. I have to get groceries.
Ah, fuck. Well, I guess, so is the stream going to end for now?
I'm pretty sure the stream is still up.
Oh, shit.
Probably we don't just have to talk about the challengers. Maybe we could also go back to the
I think that it would be fair to at least mention the very slapdash numbering scheme on the Jobelmont challengers, because that is actually fairly interesting, even if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, like I said, the Jobelmont challengers were introduced in 1942. And they actually built a total of 71 of them. The last one rolling out of the shops in 1944, but only 65 of those were really meant for Union Pacific themselves. So the first 20, which were out shopped in 1942, they were numbered 3950 through 3969. Dude. Whoa. I'm sorry that I had to make that joke again, but it was too easy. But yeah, but then the next batch of 25 challengers, they were numbered 3975 through 3999. And no, they weren't that cheap to build.
All right.
Like building a challenger for $40, no, of course that's not going to happen. But yeah, it's a bit interesting how they actually managed to skip 5 old road numbers. So if you want to make your imaginary little subgroup of engines 3970 to 3974, go ahead, because they didn't exist. But yeah, but then the last batch of Jobelmont challengers, shopped in 1944, they were surprisingly numbered 3930 through 3940. So they did decided to fill a little gap, but they filled in one gap, but they couldn't fill in the other in terms of numbering. It's bizarre.
Well,
and of course, need I remind you, the Jobelmont challengers weren't the only challengers to be around on the Union Pacific, because long before them and before the big boys even, we had the original Fetter challengers, designed by Arthur H. Fetter, whereas the Jobelmont challengers were designed by Otto Jobelmont. But those Fetter challengers, there were 40 of them built to replace older power on the Wasatch. And those were actually fairly coherent in their numbering, 3900 through 3939, later to be reclassified from 3900s into 3800s. So, yeah. Those were all built in 1936 and 1937. And would you gentlemen like to know the tractive effort of these Fetter challenges?
yes.
Okay, we still have the same sexy driving wheels. 69 inches. Boiler pressure is rated at 255 pounds per square inch, apparently. And the cylinder, surprisingly, a little bit bigger. So 22 by 32 inch compared to the 21 by 32 inch on the Jabbermon Challengers. So that's a little weird. But they get noticeably lower boiler pressure. And the tractive effort there is 97,305 pounds. But I could have sworn that it was actually just a tiny bit higher. So I'm actually a little bit curious. I gotta get my calculator out because I'm actually a little bit curious about this.
Now, after Jim has finalized the challengers, we'll be talking about the three big boys, which you're probably all wondering, what three big boys? Because we all know one, but what about the other two?
I think the other two are 4023 and 4005.
You guessed properly.
Wait, what?
You guessed correctly.
2005.
You guessed correctly, but holy crap, you guessed way too correctly. But yes, those are the two other challenges we're going to be talking about. I mean, not challenges, big boys.
Well, speaking of challengers, I think after the Fetter challengers or the Jabbermon challengers, other railroads started following Union Pacific's FEAT and tried building their own fleet. Like, the Northern Pacific and the Spokane, Portland, Seattle had their own classes.
The Delaware and Hudson also had their own challengers, though they were heavily inspired by the Union Pacific Jabbermon challengers.
Let's see. There was the Clinchfield.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of the Clinchfield, that's actually something I forgot to mention. The friggin' there were actually, like I said, there were 71 Jabbermon challengers built, and 6 of them were actually, they were still for Union Pacific, but they didn't intend on using them themselves, so they decided to lease them to the Rio Grande. But the people on the Rio Grande didn't like the challengers that much because they proved to be a little bit too slippery for them, and they were also they also tended to roll away even when they were standing still on level trackage from what I heard. So when they decided to bring them back, to give them back to Union Pacific, but then they were sold to the Clinchfield, where they were actually really popular. Though they were actually slightly modified to only have one smokestack instead of the twin smokestacks with the collapsible smoke hood around it.
Well, also, if I recall correctly, the Western Maryland also had a fleet of challengers.
Yep, they had the quirky ones, by the way, with a square smokebox door.
A what smokebox door?
Square or rectangular. The Western Maryland challengers had a very small rectangular door on the front of the smokebox.
I want to see a picture of this.
Let me get one for you. The podcast is not going to see that shit. But screw it.
Screw it. Anyway.
You guys want some corn dog nuggets?
All right, here it is.
Some nuggets. Or do you want dino nuggets?
Yes, I want dino nuggets.
Huh. That strangely looks good. 1 sec.
What the fuck is doing wrong here? Well, I'll do that calculating another time.
Anyway, so next we're going to be talking about the big boys. Well, we're going to talk in this order. We're going to talk from 4005 to 4014 last.
4005. It fell over once.
Podcast.
4005 was just so tired. It just took a nap in the middle of the job.
Well, all jokes aside, it wasn't particularly a very happy moment when it fell.
Well, to say the least.
On April 27th of 1953, and the engine was it was pulling a freight train in the morning, and it had just passed the small town of Wamsutter, Wyoming, and it was going westward, entering the Red Desert. But the tragedy kind of struck when someone had accidentally thrown a switch the wrong way, and the engine hit the switch at 50 miles per hour, and it skidded on its left-hand side, and the first 18 cars of its freight train were all scattered around, and so was the locomotive. And unfortunately, there was a death toll, 3 people, those people being the crew of the locomotive. Fireman, conductor, and engineer. I don't remember which 2 actually perished instantly, but one dude, one of the 3 men, did survive a little longer. But he died a few days later in the hospital as a result of his severe injuries. But before that, it's also noteworthy that the 4005 was the very first big boy to be converted to burn oil. But it wasn't a particularly thrilling,
not really
successful
good
experiment, or maybe it would have been, or maybe it was so-so. Like, I guess nowadays people are actually saying that it was actually successful, but I can't really say that for sure. And yeah, like I believe that there was a problem with the rather heavy fuel oil, and the fact that there was actually just a single burner installed in the firebox, which couldn't provide even heating, and as a result, it would have had poor fuel combustion. Other sources have said that mechanically it was pretty good, but it wasn't really economically viable, and that the engine was kind of struggling to get from one oil tank to the next.
And the thing is, the 4005 is the only one of the 3 that I've actually, the only one of the 3 that we'll be talking about that I've actually stood next to. And to be honest,
cool was it?
The 4005. And to be honest, nowadays that it's displayed in that museum, you would have never known that it was in such a catastrophic wreck. I mean, you can see.
There's still a little bit of cosmetic damage, I believe, on the left-hand side.
Yeah, I can see some on the tender.
I also need to explain the reason why it was converted to burn oil in the first place. It was December of 1946, and there was a nationwide coal strike. And this even affected Union Pacific because they had a bunch of coal mines, which actually mined coal to use as fuel for their steam locomotives. So naturally, things got so dire that, in addition to those previously mentioned 12 Jobelmont Challengers, they were forced to try fire a big boy with oil. Hey, Stephen, we're kind of talking about the 4005 for now. But yeah, you could also say that in relation to the 4005 derailment news, I guess you can make a very light meme by having the engine ask, "You want to know how I got these scars?"
You want to know how I got these scars? My father.
I fell on my side. And anyway,
I was a drinker, and I saw this switch, and I thought to myself, what would it be like if I flipped one when a train is coming by? So I wait for the train to come. I see it at least a few miles away, and I'm just like, let's put a smile on that face. And I just flip that switch around and let the thing yeet on its side. That, kids, is my attempt at the Joker's voice.
That was actually a really good impression, I'm not going to lie. But next, we're going to be talking about the 4023, which is a sort of sole survivor.
Yes, because like I said, the 4023 is the only big boy from 1944 to be preserved. Yes, there were 25 big boys built in total between 1941 and 1944. And they were numbered 4,000 through 4024. But here's one thing that some people don't really know. They weren't all built in one continuous batch. Union Pacific started out with 20 of them built in 1941, and then they ordered an additional 5 as part of a whole last generalized batch of steam locomotives in 1944. Once again, those being those Class 2 big boys as they were classified. The last batch of Jobelmon Challengers, which were classified as the 4664 dash 5s, and the FEF 3 Northerns. And what's kind of interesting, especially when it comes to those big boys, technically speaking, they were actually a tiny bit bigger and heavier compared to the original 20 big boys from 1941. Mainly also because a different steel was used in their construction that was heavier to begin with. Because by that time, the lighter steel had been prioritized for the war effort. But yeah, the 4023 is the only one of the Class 2 big boys to escape the torch. The other 4 they're no longer with us.
And pretty much 4023 is actually I think the second to last big boy to be built.
Yeah. Last one was 4024.
And now we go on to the big guns, the big shot, the ultimate excursion star to this date. Say it with me now. 4014.
2014.
Yes. The 4014, the only Union Pacific big boy to ever operate a passenger train of any sort.
Most likely.
Most likely.
I mean, yeah, there were rumors that, I heard documentaries say that the big boys were using troop train service, which, they were special military passenger trains to transport soldiers to and from, from airports or shipping yards, whatever, to be sent off to combat or where they were returning from. But I haven't seen a single picture of a big boy in troop train service. So yeah, all the images I've seen of them show them pulling freight trains or seeing them light, so on their own.
I mean,
yeah, with 4014, definitely you can tell that it was used for passenger trains, at least in terms of excursions and rail tours and whatever.
So what is the story of the 4014? And why was specifically 4014 chosen to be the lucky locomotive to be restored to operating condition?
Well, Andrew, 4014, some of us may already know, built in 1941, so when it comes to the 3 UP steam giants, it's the biggest and the oldest, even though it's the last one to be reacquired. But anyway, the engine operated for about 19 and a half years. No, wait, not about 17 and a half years, actually, because it was built in December of 1941, roughly when America got bombed at Pearl Harbor by the fucking Japanese. Apologies for the apple bomb. But yeah, it was retired in July of 1959. And then it was donated to the Southern California chapter of the Railway Locomotive Historical Society. And so the engine was put on display at the Open Air Rail Giants Train Museum. But there was a big advantage, actually, because that museum was located in Pomona, California. And over the years, it didn't rain very much there. So compared to the other big boys that were preserved or stored outside, the 4014 survived the elements really, really well. Furthermore, the museum actually took very good care of it by actually doing a little bit of mechanical maintenance on it, like oiling all the bearings, etc. I think that at least once a year, if they had the chance, they would even actually roll it back and forth a little bit. So they got the forethought that maybe one day in the very distant future, Union Pacific would maybe want this locomotive back.
And
guess what?
boy, did that happened.
Then, of course, in late April and May of 2014, it was actually moved home. Like it was back on the main network in January of 2014. But then, it finally arrived back home in Cheyenne in May. Then in November of 2016, they finally started the refurbishment with major disassembling of the locomotive. And in late April and early May of 2019, guess what? They finished it. They reached their deadline, which was the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike celebrations, which were initially held for the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Point in Utah on May 10th of 1869.
I mean,
But there was, of course, a minor bit of cheating involved, I suppose, because the locomotive itself was beautifully repaired. Like, the repairs and the refurbishment on the 4014 itself were absolutely exquisite. But, Big Brother had to steal the Challenger's tender. So, yeah, you could say it's actually borrowing it for long term, but, yeah, they basically just swapped tenders around between the 4014 and the 3985.
Well,
Surprisingly, the 3985's tender was in good enough mechanical shape, and it was already set up for its fuel bunker was already a friggin' oil tank.
Here's one thing that I feel that I like to say. I mean, it's just a tender, but it's still 3985, so you can kind of say that 3985 somewhat participated in the 150 celebration.
I mean, the tender was actually briefly unnumbered. I knew that, like, maybe Union Pacific kind of knew, like, they would probably get just a tiny bit of flack if they kept 3985 on the back of that centipede tender with the oil bunker for from the Challenger. So they decided, let's paint it black, and then we'll paint 4014 on it when we're done, when we're back home in Cheyenne. But also, I think, I forgot to mention what I was going to say. God damn it.
well, either way, to be honest, I praise the Union Pacific for doing this because, I mean, most people would just celebrate the 150th anniversary by recreating the whole scene. But nope, you bring it up 1,000 times much, and what do? You bring back and restore this big boy locomotive. What other railroad do you think would actually do that?
Not to mention, it was actually a little bit of a historic run because it was the very first time that an oil-fired big boy went over the Harriman Cutoff, which is Track 3 over Sherman Hill. Because when the 4005 burned oil, that track hadn't been built yet.
Wow.
Oh, and I think I remember what I was going to say now. Yeah. They technically made the 4014 a bit more powerful, too. Because, of course, I'm talking about the tractive effort. You guys want to know the tractive effort of the big boys, don't you?
Yes.
All right, let me look that up for you, gentlemen.
Because I actually want to know this. I don't know the tractive effort of the big boy. All I know is the tractive effort of the A's, the Y, 6B's, and, the J's.
I kind of know this out of the top of my head, so it's fairly easy. But yeah, hey, wait a minute, that's a little bit wrong. But
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, finally. I don't know what the deal is with this shitty phone. But I was hearing, you telling the story about the Class 2 big boys and the 4014.
Yeah. Anyway, I was about to mention the tractive effort. Basically, the big boys, they had slightly smaller driving wheels compared to both types of Challengers. 68 inches, so not quite that sexy. But they did have a higher boiler pressure, 300 psi. And when built, the size of the cylinders, 23.7 23.75 by 32 inch. Again, 4 of them. So total tractive effort will be 135,375 pounds. But then during the refurbishment of the 4014,
Don't leave your nasty napkins on.
UP Steam manager Ed Dickens decided to take just a tiny little tweak. Which, if you look closely on the side of the cab nowadays, you know what it is. He made the cylinders a teeny tiny bit bigger. Basically, they increased the diameter a little bit to 24 inches. Like, you wouldn't be able to see it on the outside because it's the internal cavity that got a little bit bigger. But with those 24-inch diameter cylinders, tractive effort of the 4014 is now rated at 138,240 pounds.
Damn.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's not much, but it's
You
not
magnificent bastards!
things. But hey, if you increase the tractive effort by more than 2,000 pounds, it's still counts as a fairly hefty increase. Even if the total number is still, even though it's only a minor difference between roughly 135,000 and 138,000, because who cares at that point? But still. Oh yeah, I also remember now. Like when Union Pacific was converting the 4014 to burn oil, there were people out there who said, "Oh, it's no longer American." Like, dude, shut the fuck.
Of course.
When Union Pacific was going to refurbish the big boy, they had made it very clear that they didn't have to run it on coal. Actually, they were going to convert it to burn oil anyway.
I mean, besides, remember 3985 in the grass fires?
I already mentioned that before you actually joined, Stephen. So
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I remember.
But yeah, that's a good enough reason why they don't want to make it burn coal. But
it's also more expensive.
A good example of somebody who doesn't apparently like 4014 on oil, I believe, was Ross Rowland. He said that oil burning steam engines are not real steam engines.
Yeah, that was an unnecessary stab.
But
He's not compared to the YouTube troll that is Kevin Samoa, who kind of went around on all kinds of videos of the 4014's refurbishment, and he's complaining about how it burns oil, like it's not restored, it's modified. Dude, they weren't going to repair and restore it to be exactly like it was in 1941. They were going to update it and make it suitable for 21st century steam locomotion. And that involves burning oil, so you won't have to deal with as many friggin' angry environmentalists.
What makes it more funny is that saying that the big boy not being oil is saying it's not fully American anymore. What makes it so ironic is that one of the United States stereotypes is oil.
Yeah.
So I'm just hearing that, I'm just like, huh?
A bottle of baby
Probably a bunch of redneck coal miners.
Oh, well. Oil bad for steam engine.
Pretty much the only steam engine that didn't do well on oil was
my favorite steam locomotive of all time. My favorite steam locomotive of all time is Reading 2100. Anyway.
So also recently in 2020, the UP Steam program canceled 2020 excursions, but they are looking forward for 2021.
But
because obviously they were canceled because of the coronavirus.
But now that we've talked about what has happened with the Union Pacific Steam program, let's talk about the future. Let's say I'm going to put in a little bit of a seed into your brain. Let's say Union Pacific had the budget to restore a third engine. What do you think that engine would be?
Oh, I know this one. Can I say it?
Sure.
Okay.
Union Pacific 4122, number 9000.
No.
And you couldn't have been more wrong. Sorry, Michael, but the problem with running a steam locomotive is because, the FEAT cylinder is hidden underneath the boiler, and that's going to cause, that will in turn give a lot of
I already went to it.
very intensive maintenance.
Oh, in a little bit, yes.
Like, 3-cylinder steam engines weren't even that particularly practical in the United States, given the way how they built their frames. They literally casted with the cylinders as one cohesive chunk of steel known as the engine bed. And besides, with 12 driving wheels on a rigid frame, even if the 9000s were fairly successful, there were a lot of places where you couldn't really run them because
Yeah,
the
that's
wheels
what I
were
wanted
just
to
a
add.
little bit too rigid. Firstly, I would just say, refurbish 3985 again. Because that's what a lot of people really want. They want to see the Challenger and the Big Boy do a double header or run side by side like the brothers that they really are.
Personally, I would like to see 814 return. I mean, well, I don't know why. It's the sole survivor of, I dare say, the most underrated out of all the FEF Northerns, the FEF1. I mean, I like those ones better than the other classes.
I mean, it's in really rough shape, but I can kind of see why. I mean, again, the 814 does look quite a bit different compared to the other UP Northerns because basically the FEF1s, they were a little bit more crude and kind of noteworthy is that they had the steam dome and sand dome separated from each other, whereas on the FEF2s and 3s, they were clustered together in a single housing.
Yeah, it's a little bit awkward. It kind of reminds me, I think the S-16 steam dome looks like a sand dome. You know, the USA, the U.S. Army engine.
Yeah, I know what you
For me, I honestly can't think of a steam locomotive to be added for the Union Pacific steam fleet because I think 3985, 4014, and 844 they're good enough locomotives. Like they've got they've got the perfect power, perfect speed. They just seem perfect.
Yes.
I originally thought, hey, why not 5511? Because she's in Cheyenne Roundhouse. But now but after like learning of some shit on her, I'm just like, okay, no, never mind. Because what I've learned is 5511's condition is actually very, very poor. Like, I think it's around just as bad as 3985's.
if not a little bit worse, or only slightly better.
Probably a bit worse.
And not to mention, the engine wouldn't really be suited for, mainline services because,
locomotive.
Let me also give you guys the rundown for those unfamiliar with the 55 engine, with the 5511, that is.
I actually don't know about it.
It's Union Pacific's only surviving 210-2 Santa Fe type, and if I'm correct, the only preserved steam locomotive with the young valve gear, which looks kind of trippy and fucky when it's in motion. So basically, long story short, it wouldn't be good for excursion passenger service on the Union Pacific because it's a slow-moving locomotive that can only do 40 miles an hour at best. So that doesn't even sound fast here in the Netherlands. I mean, that's 64 kilometers per hour. So, yeah, it's a slow-moving engine. Not to mention that it's fitted with old-fashioned friction bearings, which on Class 1 railroads are nowadays ruled out. You need to have a locomotive fitted with roller bearings if it stands any kind of chance of being used on for decent high-speed running. And, it has pretty small driving wheels, so it couldn't really go very, very fast.
Well,
and basically, if you put the 5511 on the main line today, it wouldn't be very good at flowing decently with regularly scheduled freight traffic but instead it will be very good at holding it up.
I mean, from what I've heard, okay, I'm checking this thing on steamlocomotive.com, and it said that the UP shop crew actually would like to get the locomotive out of the roundhouse and off to somewhere like a museum.
Huh.
After all, because it is the last the last of its class, and it does have the not so common young valve gear, and it would make a great museum display piece. And it hasn't been used much over the years, except to pull it out of the roundhouse for the UP Historical Society convention a few years ago. And cosmetically, it looked pretty good. Shop crew painted it for the convention and posted on the turntable for photos at one point.
Yeah.
Not to mention its size would be limited. I mean, it wouldn't really be suiting for most tourist lines. I mean, I don't know if it. I'm not so sure if it would be suited for the, like, say, Blue Mountain and Reading, despite the fact that they operated in Northern at one point.
Really, I really don't know what would I'll be honest. I have no idea what would a railroad in Pennsylvania would want with a Union Pacific 210-2. Then again,
I'm just giving that as an example because, they were able to operate a big Northern with friction bearings, by the way, but which I'm assuming is much longer than the 5511. I'm not saying that it'd be. I mean, I'm just giving it as an example. Also, may I point out that the Chinese QJs are able to go faster, if I'm not mistaken. Like, take 6988, for example, on the Iowa Interstate. It's able to go, 50 on the main line, by the way.
I mean, it is a more modern design. So.
Well,
by the way, I actually found some stats on the 5511.
Well, guys.
Specifically, I think it's classified as a TTT6 or TTT7. I think for 210-2, obviously. There were 25 of them. 5500 through 5524, all built in 1923 by Baldwin. And let's see, tractive effort, in case you're curious. Yeah, those are some very small driving wheels, only 63 inches.
That's about the size of the Canucks driving wheels.
That's about the size of the 769's driving wheels.
Those drive wheels are bigger than the 433s, by the way. The Mastodons, the N&W M classes, they had 56-inch drivers. Yet those engines can go faster. Then again, the same can also be said for the QJs. They have smaller driving wheels, yet they can go 50.
May I return to quickly get into tractive effort of the 5511?
Yes.
And yes, let's see what it is.
Like I said, 63-inch diameter driving wheels, 200 psi of boiler pressure, 29.5 by 30-inch cylinders, and total tractive effort is 70,449 pounds.
Damn,
not bad, but again, not great for high-speed running.
Well, that was
If you had a flat, tourist line with nice gentle curves that could handle that big engine, then maybe that would be the best chance for it to return. Honestly.
Maybe.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Actually, I think 5511 would handle the same curves as 4014 or 844. It's just 9,000 that we really need to worry about when it comes to curves. That.
Because it's a little bit too big for tourist lines, especially if it's Great Smoky Mountains Railroad. I know that's a stupid example, but I've seen how tight the curves are there, and they operate just a little Connie 1702, which also, by the way, is oil fired.
But, well, that's this episode of Burning Subjects, and well. Next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about we're not going to be talking about a railroad or a steam program of some sort. Next week, we're going to be talking about a top 10 list. And that top 10 list is going to be the top 10 steam locomotives that have not steamed in the preservation era. Whether it's locomotives that can operate in the distant future or locomotives that will never operate again. This is going to be the top 10 locomotives that have not operated in the preservation era. So this has been the Cylinder Cox.
Could be a good, a good example of that.
Yeah.
Save that for later.
Yes. But either way, this has been Burning Subjects, and we'll see you next Tuesday.